You hear that? Staff Sergeant Kyle Mercer slapped the dead A-10's weathered fuselage with the back of his glove and grinned at the men around him. That's the sound of 40 years begging for retirement. Laughter rolled across the flight line, sharp and easy, cutting through the furnace heat rising off the concrete at Fort Redstone. The attack jet sat motionless under a shimmer of heat haze, its gray skin faded by sun and age, twin engines silent as tombstones. For 6 hours the best avionics crew on the base had fed diagnostics into ruggedized laptops, checked continuity, swapped modules, run fuel pressure tests, and still the Warthog refused to breathe. Yet now, while the countdown clock over the maintenance hangar showed 18 minutes until a major demonstration for visiting brass, an old man in a faded olive jacket stood beside the aircraft with one wrinkled hand resting on its metal skin as if listening for a heartbeat. "Careful, Grandpa," Mercer called, loud enough for the whole crew to hear. "Touching it won't raise the dead." More laughter. Lieutenant Ryan Cole folded his arms and watched with polished impatience. "Sir, this is a restricted maintenance area," he said, the word sir carrying no respect at all. "General Hale did not bring you out here to play mechanic." But Walter Boone barely looked at him. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the engine cowling, on something none of them could see. Wind pushed across the runway, carrying the smell of jet fuel and scorched rubber. Somewhere a tug vehicle rattled past. Walter slid his fingers over a panel seam and tilted his head slightly, like a man catching a whisper in a crowded room. Mercer smirked. "What is he doing, hearing ghosts?" Walter answered so quietly several men leaned in without realizing it. "She's trying to tell you what hurts." Even Cole laughed at that. The old man moved closer to the intake, placed one ear near the metal, and closed his eyes. Around him, young airmen traded amused glances. To them he was a relic dragged from a museum because some sentimental general still believed in legends. To Walter, the aircraft was not metal and hydraulics. It was memory. It was desert dawns. And runway dust and the low thunder of engines returning home. Mercer stepped closer, boot heels striking concrete. "We've got software worth $500,000 telling us every subsystem is green," he said. "What exactly are you hearing that the computers missed?" Walter opened his eyes. "A lie." The word landed strangely heavy. Even the laughter thinned. Cole checked his watch, tension tightening his jaw. The demonstration was collapsing by the minute. Visiting commanders waited in shaded bleachers beyond the ramp. Careers could bend under failures like this. But pride was stronger than fear. "Mr. Boone," Cole said coldly, "unless you can restart an A-10 by prayer, step away from the aircraft." Walter's weathered hand drifted to a narrow access panel low beneath the nacelle. His fingertips stopped on one bolt head. He frowned. Heat shimmer danced over the runway. The metal ticked softly in the sun. And then, almost to himself, he murmured, that bolt was torqued by a man who didn't trust what he was sealing. Mercer laughed again, louder this time, masking unease. Now the old man's reading personalities off hardware. But from the far edge of the crew, Airman Noah Reed had gone still. Because for the first time all morning, someone was looking at the jet instead of the screens. And in the growing roar of tension beneath the desert wind, the old veteran laid his palm flat against the dead engine and whispered words none of them understood. "Come on, girl. Wake up." Noah Reed did not move at first. He only stared at the bolt Walter Boone had touched, a plain steel fastener no different from the others to every eye on the flight line. Yet the old veteran was still watching it with the kind of patience Mercer mistook for confusion. "This is getting ridiculous," Mercer muttered, stepping forward and dragging a grease pencil across his clipboard. "We are burning minutes babysitting a ghost story." The countdown clock now showed 16 minutes. Across the tarmac, ground crews moved with clipped urgency around support vehicles, but inside the circle around the dead aircraft something had slowed, as if time itself had leaned closer. Walter traced the edge of the panel. "Open it." Lieutenant Cole laughed once, humorless. That panel is factory sealed. Then break the seal. The young lieutenant's face tightened. You do not crack open a subsystem because somebody feels a vibration. Walter finally looked at him, calm as weathered stone. That is because you were trained to trust the indicator before the machine. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Mercer scoffed, but there was edge in it now. We have run every test. Walter nodded toward the nacelle. And every test listened to sensors talking to each other. None listened to the aircraft. Noah felt something stir in his chest, the strange unease that comes when confidence begins to sound rehearsed. Mercer dropped his clipboard onto a toolbox with a metallic crack. Fine, he said. Explain the magic trick. Walter crouched with effort, knuckles brushing hot concrete, and pointed at the bolt head. See that faint scoring around the washer? Someone removed it before. Reinstalled under stress. Torque is a hair off. Enough to pinch a hydraulic relay line once heat expands the housing. Silence. Even Cole hesitated. Mercer forced a laugh. That is impossible. You cannot read that by eye. Walter's gaze drifted for one fleeting second beyond the runway, and the air seemed to shift around him. Heat shimmer became desert mirage. The smell of jet fuel became hot dust and hydraulic mist. He was 24 again, kneeling under a bruised Middle Eastern dawn beside an A-10 riddled by sand and failure, hearing a young pilot say if the engines did not light before sunrise, men on the ground would be stranded. He remembered fingers blackened with grease, a field wrench worn smooth by use, and a bolt torqued 1 degree wrong nearly killing a squadron. The memory passed like rotor wash. He stood. I have seen this failure before. Mercer folded his arms tighter, but Noah caught it then, the smallest flicker of uncertainty. Cole checked the clock. 14 minutes. We do not have time for folklore. Walter reached into his faded jacket and withdrew a scarred leather pouch, its snap polished from decades of touch. Mercer smirked when he saw it. What is that, some museum? Peace. Walter opened it and removed a narrow hand-ground wrench dark with age. Noah stared. It looked absurd beside modern tooling, and somehow more serious. One turn, Walter said. That is all I need. Cole started to refuse, but Noah stepped forward before he understood why. Sir, what if he is right? Mercer turned on him. Airmen, do not embarrass yourself. Yet Noah had stopped hearing Mercer. His pulse was climbing. Because for the first time all morning the dead aircraft no longer looked silent. It looked waiting. Wind moved across the runway flags. Somewhere in the distance thunder muttered though the sky was clear. Walter placed the old wrench against the sealed panel, and before anyone could stop him, Noah reached for his radio with a hand that had begun to shake, knowing if he made the call he was crossing a line, and somehow believing he already had. Noah Reed's thumb hovered over the radio switch for half a breath before he keyed the channel. His voice came low, almost swallowed by the wind. Operations, this is Airman Reed on Maintenance Apron 3. I need command liaison verification on a civilian consultant named Walter Boone. Mercer heard it and wheeled around as if struck. What did you just do? Noah did not answer. Walter Boone had already turned the old wrench one deliberate quarter turn. A tiny metallic click sounded from inside the sealed panel, so soft it should have meant nothing, yet every man there heard it. Lieutenant Cole stepped forward, fury rising. Stand away from that aircraft. But Walter was listening again, palm against warm aluminum, head bowed slightly. Pressure just eased, he murmured. Mercer snatched a diagnostic tablet and ran fresh readings. His smirk vanished. Fuel feed fluctuation that had danced randomly all morning had flattened. One warning ghosted off the screen. He blinked, then checked again as if the software itself had betrayed him. That cannot be right. Walter held out the wrench to Noah. Another 8th turn. Noah hesitated only a second before taking it. Mercer looked ready to explode. "Airmen, if you touch that panel, let him," Walter said, not raising his voice. Something in the old man's tone cut through the shouting. Noah obeyed. The wrench moved. Another tiny click. Across the tarmac a service truck rolled by, its diesel rumble mixing with the dry whistle of runway wind. Then every screen on Mercer's portable rig chimed at once. System faults cleared. The flight line seemed to inhale. Mercer stared, mouth slightly open. No, it was almost a whisper. But Walter had already stepped toward the cockpit ladder. Power cycle auxiliary. Cole moved to stop him. "You are not authorized, neither is losing a demonstration in 11 minutes, Walter replied. That shut even the lieutenant still. Noah's radio crackled. A clipped voice answered from command. "Repeat consultant name." Noah swallowed. "Walter Boone." Silence. Then static hiss. Then another voice cut in, older, sharper. "Stand by." Mercer noticed the change in Noah's face and felt something colder than embarrassment. He looked back at Walter climbing halfway up the ladder with the ease of muscle memory, fingers brushing switches he had not touched in decades. Heat shimmer rolled off the concrete. The old leather pouch hung from his wrist. And suddenly Walter was not 82. In the set of his shoulders there was the ghost of the crew chief he had once been. He leaned into the cockpit and spoke to the machine as though greeting an old friend. "Wake up for me." Mercer muttered, almost to himself, "This is insane." But Noah barely heard him. His radio erupted again. "Airman Reed, maintain position. Major General Hale is en route." Noah froze. Mercer heard it too. Blood drained from his face. "The General?" Cole stepped closer. "For him." No one answered. Walter climbed down and pointed toward the auxiliary power unit controls. "Prime it." Mercer did not even realize he obeyed until his hand was already moving. Switches engaged. Somewhere deep inside the aircraft a low electrical hum stirred for the first time all day. It was faint, fragile, almost imagined. But every head turned toward the sound. The dead machine had spoken. Wind snapped a distant flag hard against its pole. The countdown clock showed 10 minutes. Mercer looked at Walter Boone with something like fear replacing mockery. And as the auxiliary whine slowly rose like a sleeping animal drawing breath, black staff sedans appeared at the far edge of the runway, racing toward the flight line under a cloud of dust. The auxiliary whine climbed higher, thin and trembling at first, then steadier, like an old voice finding strength. Every man on the line stood motionless except Walter Boone. He did not watch the gauges. He watched the air itself, feeling vibration through the soles of his boots. "Hold it there," he said quietly. Mercer's hand froze over the control panel. The younger man who had mocked him all morning now obeyed without thinking. Dust curled under the arriving black sedans as they cut across the apron, tires hissing over sun-baked concrete. But no one looked toward them yet. All eyes were fixed on the old veteran and the machine that had begun, impossibly, to stir. Walter stepped back to the open access panel and touched the warm metal around the bolt. His fingers lingered there, and the world seemed to recede behind his pale blue stare. The shimmer over the runway became another horizon. Hot jet exhaust became desert wind over a remote strip carved from hardpan. He was no longer standing at Fort Redstone but kneeling in a dawn-washed copper by dust, one hand inside an A-10 nacelle while a pilot above him called down fuel pressures and prayer in equal measure. Hydraulic mist coated his face. The engine had coughed then too, fighting to live. He remembered the exact sound a dying relay made when heat pinched its line. Not failure. A plea. The memory passed through him like rotor wash. Back on the apron, he turned to Mercer. "She is asking for ignition." Mercer swallowed. "If this burns the starter," Walter gave the faintest smile. She has already forgiven worse. Lieutenant Cole looked toward the sedans just as doors opened and uniformed aides spilled out. Then a tall silver-haired officer stepped from the lead car, cap in hand, moving faster than a man of rank usually moved. Major General Thomas Hale. Mercer went rigid. Noah Reed forgot to breathe. But the general did not speak. He only stared at Walter Boone, recognition striking like a physical force. "Prime on my mark," Walter said. Mercer's fingers hovered. The auxiliary whine deepened. Metal ticked in the heat. Wind pressed across the runway in one long breath. Walter lifted one weathered hand. "Now." Mercer hit ignition. At first there was only a shudder. Then a low rotational growl rolled through the nacelle. Several airmen stepped back instinctively. Gauges jumped. Cole whispered, "No way." The second engine coughed once, then again, and Walter moved his head slightly, listening, reading every vibration. Again. Mercer obeyed. This time the starter caught harder. A pulse moved through the airframe. Then with a deep mechanical surge that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself, the first engine roared alive. Heat blasted behind the aircraft. Dust spiraled in widening rings. Men threw arms up against the wash. Some shouted but the sound vanished under turbine thunder. Mercer stumbled backward, staring as if witnessing something sacred and impossible. Walter did not smile. He only nodded once, almost sadly, like greeting an old friend returned. The second engine began winding up in answer. Twin turbines gathering voice. Noah looked toward General Hale and saw something that stunned him even more than the engines. The general had come to attention. Not for ceremony. Not for cameras. For Walter Boone. His jaw was tight with memory. His eyes bright. And over the roar, just loud enough for Mercer alone to hear, the general said, "I told them the old man could still raise Thunderhawks from the dead." Mercer could not answer. He could only watch as Walter reached out and rested one hand on the vibrating fuselage while the second engine thundered fully alive, and the dead aircraft that had mocked every modern expert now breathed beneath the touch of a forgotten crew chief. The engines settled into a deep predatory idle, their thunder rolling across Fort Redstone like distant storm surf. For a long moment no one moved. Dust drifted back to earth in slow spirals. Heat shimmer danced behind the twin exhausts. Walter Boone kept his hand against the fuselage, feeling the pulse he had coaxed back into life. Then he stepped away as if the miracle no longer belonged to him. Staff. Sergeant Kyle Mercer stood rooted where the turbine wash had driven him, grease on his sleeve, disbelief written openly across a face that had carried nothing but confidence that morning. He looked from the roaring aircraft to Walter, then to the old leather pouch hanging at the veteran's side, and something in him seemed to collapse inward. Major General Thomas Hale crossed the apron through the engine noise without hesitation. Aides trailed behind him but stopped several paces short, sensing they were entering something older than protocol. Hale came to stand before Walter Boone and removed his cap. The simple gesture hit harder than a shouted order. Mercer felt it in his chest. Lieutenant Cole straightened so sharply his boots scraped concrete. Noah Reed stared, trying to understand how a man they had treated like an inconvenience now stood receiving the kind of quiet deference reserved for history itself. Hale's voice carried low, steady, almost reverent. "You still listen to them better than any system we have built." Walter gave a faint shrug. "Machines tell the truth if no one interrupts them." The general smiled at that, but his eyes held memory. He turned toward Mercer. "Do you know whose field correction procedure you just watched?" Mercer tried to answer and found no words. Hale pointed to the access panel. "That relay bypass was written into emergency maintenance doctrine after Operation Desert Shield. It exists because Sergeant Boone invented it under combat conditions when a squadron should have been grounded." The word struck the younger men with the force of revelation. Noah looked at Walter differently now, not as legend but as source. Mercer swallowed hard. Sir, we mocked him. Hale did not raise his voice. Yes. You did. The shame in Mercer's face was punishment enough. Walter saved him from it. He mocked what he did not recognize. That can be cured. Wind moved across the apron carrying the smell of hot turbine metal. In the viewing stands beyond the runway, visiting officers had risen, drawn by the impossible sight of the once dead aircraft idling under its own strength. But here, inside the roar, the world had narrowed to 5 men and a truth unfolding. Cole glanced at the countdown clock. 4 minutes until demonstration. General, should we proceed with backup aircraft? Hale looked almost offended. Backup? He gestured toward the Warthog. You have your lead bird. Then he turned to Walter. Will she taxi? Walter tilted his head, listening again, eyes half closed. The old instinct had not left him. Port engine is running a touch lean. Mercer stepped forward instantly. Tell me where. Walter motioned him closer, and for the first time the young sergeant leaned in, not as skeptic but student. Walter pointed to a fuel trim adjustment and spoke in a low measured cadence Mercer absorbed like scripture. Noah watched the transfer of knowledge happen in real time. No speech. No lecture. Just mastery passed hand to hand. Mercer made the correction. Gauges steadied. Walter nodded once. Approval from him felt larger than rank. Then, to everyone's surprise, Major General Hale stepped back and raised his hand in salute. Not theatrical. Not ceremonial. Quiet. Exact. Walter Boone returned it after a pause that seemed to hold decades. Even the engine roar felt hushed around that exchange. Mercer, almost without thinking, came to attention beside Noah Reed. Lieutenant Cole followed. 3 young men who had laughed hours earlier now stood in silence before a forgotten crew chief, while the old A-10 idled like a beast awakened, waiting for the runway. The runway clearance truck pulled away and the apron opened before them like a stage none of the young airmen were ready to step onto. The engines held their deep steady growl, no longer a miracle but a presence, alive and waiting. Walter Boone looked toward the long strip of concrete stretching into heat shimmer and nodded once. She wants to move. Major General Hale gave a single sharp signal. Ground crews scattered into motion. What had been a maintenance embarrassment moments ago had become a live demonstration reshaped by legend. Yet the greatest change was quieter. It stood in Kyle Mercer. The swagger had drained from him, replaced by a concentration almost reverent. He moved beside Walter now with the careful attentiveness of an apprentice beside a master. Fuel trim holding, Mercer reported, voice controlled but carrying awe he could not hide. Walter listened to the turbine cadence and tilted his head. Listen under the idle. There is a soft flutter in the port compressor. Not dangerous. Just age. Mercer actually smiled, faint and humbled. I hear it now. Walter gave him a look of approval so slight another man might have missed it, but Mercer felt it like a metal pinned in silence. Lieutenant Cole approached slower than before, rank stripped bare by what he had witnessed. Mr. Boone, he faltered over the name, as though discovering how small authority sounded beside earned mastery. I misjudged you. Walter's weathered face remained calm. So did many before you. There was no sting in it. Only fact. Noah Reed stood a few paces back absorbing everything, sensing the day was becoming something retold long after all of them were gone. Beyond the apron, rows of visiting officers watched from the shaded stands, their binoculars lifted, murmurs spreading as word moved through the ranks that the old consultant at the dead aircraft was Walter Boone. Some knew the name. Others only felt the strange gravity gathering around it. Major General Hale stepped closer and lowered his voice so only the circle around him heard. There is one thing they do not teach anymore. He looked at Mercer. When Boone was 26, pilots used to say he could hear faults before instruments did. Mercer glanced at Walter with disbelief renewed. That is impossible. Walter almost chuckled. No. Just slower than computers and older than manuals. Wind moved over the tarmac carrying the smell of hot oil and summer dust. Then Hale did something none of them expected. He held out the aircraft checklist to Walter. Lead the taxi. A hush fell, deeper than engine roar. Mercer stared. Even Cole forgot protocol. Walter looked at the paper but did not take it. The young sergeant will run the checklist. He nodded toward Mercer. He has earned the lesson. Mercer looked stricken. Sir. I am not ready. Walter's pale eyes settled on him. That is why you begin now. The word struck Mercer harder than any reprimand. He took the checklist with both hands. Voice unsteady at first, he began calling procedures. Walter answered each item from memory without once looking inside the cockpit. Battery. Hydraulics. Flight controls. Anti-skid. Every response came measured, exact. Noah felt he was hearing liturgy. The old jet rolled inches as brakes released, tires creaking against concrete. The Warthog was moving. A spontaneous murmur rose from the viewing stands. Mercer paused halfway through the sequence and looked toward Walter. Why did you come when the general called? Walter watched sunlight glint off the nose of the aircraft. Because some machines should not die misunderstood. Mercer lowered his eyes. He understood the words were not only about aircraft. Then from the command tower a taxi clearance came over the radio, crisp and official. Hale smiled faintly. Gentlemen, he said, stepping aside as the old A-10 began to crawl toward the runway under Mercer's trembling hands and Walter Boone's calm supervision, you are about to watch memory take flight. The old A-10 rolled onto the taxiway with a slow muscular certainty, nose-wheel tracking centerline as though it had never been dead at all. Heat waves shimmered behind the twin engines. The sound of turbine power rose and fell in deep breathing pulses that seemed to vibrate through the chest more than the ear. Kyle Mercer read the checklist now with growing steadiness, every call sharpened by purpose. Flight controls free. Walter Boone rested one hand on the canopy rail and nodded. Advanced throttle 2%. Mercer obeyed. The aircraft crept faster. Around them, mechanics, officers, and visitors had gone strangely silent, as if instinct told them they were witnessing something larger than a recovered maintenance failure. Major General Hale stood with cap tucked beneath one arm, watching not the aircraft but the old crew chief guiding a young sergeant through forgotten craft. Noah Reed felt the shape of the day changing in his memory even while living it. This was already becoming story. At the hold short line the A-10 paused. Tower cleared immediate demonstration pass. Mercer looked at Walter. Sir, if she surges. Walter studied the runway stretching 2 miles into the wavering horizon. Then you listen before you react. The words sounded simple. They carried the weight of decades. Mercer nodded. For the first time that day he was not trying to prove competence. He was trying to deserve instruction. Walter motioned him toward the left intake. Hear the compressor spool. It is smoother now. Mercer listened and smiled in disbelief. I can hear it. Walter answered almost gently. That is because you stopped arguing with the machine. The phrase stayed with Noah like scripture. Then Hale stepped forward unexpectedly and addressed Mercer in a voice low enough to force attention. Do you know why Boone was called Ghost Wrench? Mercer shook his head. Hale looked toward the old man, eyes carrying old admiration. Because when aircraft were written off, he brought them home. Mercer stared at Walter with open awe. Walter only looked mildly embarrassed. Pilots made up names when they were scared. But before anyone could answer, the tower called final clearance. The runway belonged to them. Mercer's throat tightened. Walter touched the fuselage once more and stepped back from the ladder. Your throttle, Sergeant. Mercer froze. Mine. You brought her back with me, Walter said. Now trust her. It was a gift heavier than rank. Mercer climbed into the cockpit under supervision, hands trembling over controls. Noah could hardly breathe. Lieutenant Cole stood rigid beside the general, no trace left of the man who had mocked a civilian consultant hours before. Mercer advanced power. The engines answered with a gathering thunder that rolled across the field and silenced even the wind. Dust spiraled in rings behind the tail. The old attack jet began its takeoff roll, first deliberate, then accelerating with predatory hunger. Every eye tracked it. Walter stood still, shoulders slightly bowed, face unreadable except for the faintest glint in pale eyes. At rotation speed the nose lifted. Wheels left concrete. A murmur swept the stands, then applause broke before dying again as the aircraft climbed low and powerful against a hard blue sky. It banked once over the base, sunlight flashing. Across wings. Noah felt his throat tighten. Mercer's voice came over tower frequency, no longer shaky. She flies smooth. Walter looked down as if hearing a voice from long ago. Hale stepped beside him. You just made believers out of a generation. Walter watched the aircraft arc overhead and answered softly, no. The old girl did. Then something happened that none of the young airmen would ever forget. As the A-10 roared past in a thunderous ceremonial pass, every officer on the viewing stand rose at once and snapped to attention, not for the aircraft, but for the quiet old crew chief standing alone at the runway edge, his jacket moving in the hot wind like a forgotten flag returned. The A-10 completed its pass and circled wide over Fort Redstone, engine thunder fading into a distant rolling growl before building again as it lined up for approach. No one in the viewing stand sat down. Officers remained standing in stunned silence, many with binoculars lowered, watching not the aircraft now but Walter Boone. The old crew chief seemed almost uncomfortable under the weight of their attention. He stood with one hand resting on the worn leather pouch at his side, as though grounding himself in something older than praise. Beside him, Major General Hale looked less like a commanding officer than a man revisiting unfinished history. Kyle Mercer's voice came over tower frequency again, steadier now, carrying wonder no regulation could conceal. Controls are crisp. She feels alive. Walter looked toward the sky and answered under his breath, though Mercer could not hear him. She always was. Noah Reed heard it and felt the words settle deep. The aircraft descended in a graceful arc and touched runway with a chirp of tires, rolling back toward the apron under perfect control. But before it reached them, Hale turned toward the assembled senior officers from the reviewing stand who had begun crossing the tarmac. Colonels. Wing commanders. Maintenance chiefs. Men whose insignia usually bent rooms quiet. Yet they approached Walter Boone with expressions more fitting a reunion than ceremony. One silver-haired colonel stopped 3 feet away and stared. Boone? He asked. Softly, almost disbelieving. Walter squinted, then gave a faint smile. Still owe me a torque wrench, Richard. The colonel let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter and shook his head. 40 years. Mercer watched, bewildered, as legends appeared from ordinary uniforms. The old man he had mocked was becoming larger with every minute, not because he spoke of himself, but because others kept revealing what he never had. The A-10 taxied in and slowed. Mercer climbed down from the cockpit with a face transformed. Gone was the young technician eager to prove modern systems superior. In his place stood a man who had touched humility and found purpose in it. He walked straight to Walter and held out the flight checklist with both hands. Sir, I think this belongs to you. Walter did not take it. He folded Mercer's fingers back over the paper. Keep it. Mercer looked confused. Walter nodded toward the aircraft. Every good machine teaches once. If you listen. Even Lieutenant Cole lowered his gaze at that. Then Major General Hale did something none of the gathering officers expected. He turned to the audience of brass and maintenance crews and spoke not through microphone but plainly, carrying across the hot open apron. Today you saw an aircraft return to life. But what you really saw was doctrine older than software, skill older than pride, and a man this service forgot to honor properly. Silence held. Even the turbines idled softer now, ticking as they cooled. Hale reached into his tunic pocket and withdrew a small velvet case. Noah Reed felt his breath catch. Hale opened it. Inside lay a worn unit insignia, edges softened by age. This was presented to Boone's field team after the campaign where he kept 12 damaged aircraft flying. He pinned it to Walter's faded jacket himself. No speech followed. None was needed. Mercer's eyes shone with something close to shame and gratitude mixed together. Then, almost timidly, he asked Walter, "Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" Walter looked at the idling A-10, sunlight reflecting in old eyes. "Because machines do not care who gets credit. Only whether you bring them home." The answer left no room for reply. Wind moved across the runway carrying the smell of warm metal and summer grass. And as crews gathered around the once dead aircraft, touching panels they had failed to understand, Noah realized the real reversal had not been engines roaring back to life. It was watching arrogance turn into reverence in broad daylight, while a forgotten crew chief stood quietly at the center of it, never once asking to be remembered. The afternoon sun had begun to soften by the time the crowd around the A-10 thinned, leaving long shadows across the apron and gold light along the aircraft's scarred fuselage. What had begun in ridicule now ended in an almost sacred hush. Crews moved quieter than before, voices lowered without anyone asking them to. Even the clang of tools seemed subdued. Kyle Mercer remained beside Walter Boone long after the senior officers drifted away. He had removed his gloves and held them in one hand, no longer looking like the man who had laughed at an old veteran touching cold metal. He looked younger somehow, stripped of performance. "Sir," he said at last, his voice rough with sincerity, "I will remember this day the rest of my life." Walter studied him a moment, then looked toward the aircraft cooling in the sun. Metal ticked softly as heat bled away. "Remember the lesson, not the old man." Mercer shook his head. "I do not think those can be separated." Walter almost smiled. Noah Reed stood nearby listening, knowing he would repeat those words someday to someone younger than himself. Major General Hale approached one final time, cap under his arm again, but now there was no urgency in him. Only gratitude. "Transportation is ready whenever you are," he said. Walter glanced at the black sedan waiting at the edge of the tarmac, then unexpectedly turned toward the A-10 and walked one last time to its nose. He rested his palm there, weathered hand against sun-warmed metal, and for several seconds no one interrupted him. Mercer wondered whether he was saying goodbye to an aircraft or to a part of his own life. Then Walter stepped back and removed the old leather pouch from his belt. He held it out to Mercer. The young sergeant stared. "Sir, I cannot." "Take that." Walter closed Mercer's fingers around it. "Tools belong with hands still working." Mercer's throat tightened. The pouch felt heavier than leather should. "I have not earned this." Walter looked at him with the quiet certainty that had silenced a runway. "You begin earning things when you stop believing you already have." Even Hale lowered his eyes at that. No applause followed. None would have fit. Just wind moving across concrete, carrying the smell of warm turbine metal and cut grass from the far field. Walter turned to leave, walking with the slight stoop of age returning now that the work was done. Yet before he reached the sedan, Mercer called after him. "Sir, what was the aircraft saying when you first touched it?" Walter stopped but did not turn at once. Then he looked back, pale eyes bright in the low sun. It was asking whether anyone still knew how to listen. With that he climbed into the sedan. The door shut softly. The car rolled away across the apron, shrinking into evening light until it seemed almost part of the shimmer itself. No escort sirens. No dramatic farewell. Just departure, quiet as his arrival. Mercer stood holding the old pouch while Noah Reed looked up at the fading sky where the A-10 had flown. Days later, a small bronze plaque appeared in the maintenance hangar beside the aircraft bay. It bore no grand speech. Only a line many paused to read in silence before starting their shift. Some machines remember who kept them alive. Years later young airmen would touch that plaque before difficult repairs, half ritual, half respect. And some would ask who Walter Boone had been. Mercer, older then, would only glance toward the flight line and answer the same way every time. A man who could hear truth in engines. But on that first evening, as shadows lengthened and the once dead A-10 cooled beneath a painted American sky, 3 young servicemen stood a little straighter than they had that morning. Not because a legend had humbled them. Because dignity had instructed them. And somewhere beyond the runway, beyond memory, the quiet moral settled with the last warmth of daylight: respect is not demanded. It is recognized, often in silence, and remembered long after the engines fade.